In a world that is increasingly embracing diversity, it is essential to understand how we can all contribute to a workplace where everyone feels valued and empowered. And today's guest is here to help us understand the unique challenges faced by trans and non-binary individuals. And we'll discuss how to go beyond performative support to build a genuinely inclusive workplace. Today's guest is Davey Shlasko. Davey is the founder and director of Think Again Training and Consulting. For over 2 decades, Davey has cultivated a practice of facilitating adult learning to drive organizational and systemic change for equity and justice, with a unique niche in transgender inclusion. Now, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I share new episodes and other tips for managers every week. Now, here's the conversation. Thank you so much for joining me today, Davey. I'm super excited to talk with you about gender and gender identity and gender expression and trans and like all the things that have to do with anything related to that in the workplace. And I feel like I've covered this topic tangentially when we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, but this is the first time I've really gotten to dive into the subject. And I'm so excited to have you here to enlighten us and to help us all get a little smarter today. So thanks for joining me.
Great. I'm so excited to be here.
Maybe we can start with just some basic understanding, because as I was reading your book, which is fabulous, I think everyone should read it. Remind us what the book is called.
It's called Trans Allyship Workbook.
One of the pieces that was really helpful for me was to just start to unpack and understand all of this different terminology when it comes to gender. So maybe you can start with just laying us some foundation around these different terms and what they mean and what it looks like in reality.
I'll start with defining trans or transgender, which in some spaces might have slightly different connotations, but essentially they mean the same thing, which is anyone whose gender now is different than what people guessed about them when they were born. So we can add all sorts of technical terms to pieces of that, but that's basically it. Someone whose gender is not what people guessed when they were born. Sometimes we differentiate gender identity from expression. Identity is the gender you are, who you know yourself to be, how you understand yourself as a man, a woman, a non-binary person, or any other gender. And gender expression is how that looks, how you walk, how you talk, how you dress. Sometimes the words you use to describe yourself can all be part of gender expression. I guess the other key term here would be assigned gender, which is sometimes also called sex assigned at birth. And that's the category of male or female that goes on a birth certificate, ID documents, and so on. That's not really the same as biological sex, but biological sex is basically never relevant unless you're a medical professional, so we don't even need to get into that. What's relevant is what was on your ID, what's on your ID now, what's your gender now. That's what's relevant.
These terms are really helpful, and you talk about them in the book and really, I think, explain the spectrum and the societal norms that have been laid over them. Can you say more about that?
In the dominant culture in the US right now, there's a really pervasive assumption that basically there are 2 kinds of humans. There are men and women. And that's never been true. Globally, historically, most cultures have had more than 2 gender categories. But also, every individual can experience their gender in a different way. So even among people who identify as women, some women feel attached to that in different ways than others, right? I often do an icebreaker in trans inclusion trainings where we ask something like, if your gender were an animal, what animal would it be? Or if your gender had a texture, what texture would it have? And even in a room where it looks like there's only one category, one gender in the room, the answers are basically infinite. It's not the case that all women say silky and all men say rough, right? People have infinite answers to those questions. When we have the freedom to think about our gender in a more metaphorical way, in a less categorical way. And so people in the English-speaking world are increasingly making language for that, finding ways to describe their genders more specifically and in ways that feel more true to them than just simply man or just simply woman.
One of the reasons this really resonated with me when I was reading it and hearing you say it again is, for me, it's really around like fashion. And there's the shift from there's clothing that is designed for men, there's clothing designed for women, and then there's clothing, at least we had a hot moment, and I don't know if we're still in it, where like there's kind of gender neutral clothing, or kind of clothing that is for anyone. And now, at least what I'm noticing is that even clothing that was kind of traditionally feminine is being worn by people who may present as more masculine. And maybe we've kind of already been there historically, and you can shed some light on this. But there was a while, right, where women couldn't wear pants, right? I think that, and now that has shifted and pants seems totally normal. But I'm like, why can't people who identify as male wear skirts? Like, or I don't know, there's something going on where this kind of fluidity or the expectations around gender expression are shifting. Are you seeing similar kinds of things?
I'm definitely seeing that in some settings, certainly more than others. I think that varies geographically. It varies depending on the kind of workplace. But it's absolutely true that when it became normal for women to wear what had previously been considered men's clothing was way sooner. And it still stands out if someone who we perceive as a man is wearing a skirt or long dangly earrings or something, right? I think that's standing out less and less in certain LGBTQ communities, among younger people in particular, but we still see it coming up in workplaces and causing tension. Even, for example, some of the workplaces I work with are hospitals, and basically most employees are wearing scrubs, but a man who's not in pediatrics and who's wearing like pink scrubs or scrubs with teddy bears on them or something gets comments about it, right? Gets picked on about it. Whereas women wearing solid dark blue scrubs, like most men do, is not commented on at all. So definitely that's a difference. And I think that has a lot to do with sexism and just devaluing of femininity in general. I also think it's important to differentiate that everything we're talking about right now is expression. It's not necessarily identity. So some people, when they're wearing a skirt, that has something to do with how they feel like a woman. Other people, when they're wearing a skirt, it's not about that. And so somebody's gender expression might match what's expected of their gender identity, might indicate something about their gender identity, or might kind of be a coincidence. Like gender expression is sometimes how we read gender onto someone's expression, not necessarily what they mean to communicate by it.
I think one of the reasons I wanted to start here is because what I have seen, and sometimes in my past even experience, and even still sometimes today, is that sense of discomfort from when someone's gender expression or just their expression in general doesn't align with what I perceive to be their gender identity. And that creates kind of this sense of discomfort, of confusion, of not wanting to do something wrong, of like what in the workplace. Like I had a client who is a man, and he wore high heels to a corporate event that he was working at. And I mean, as far as I know, no one said anything to him. But I was like, I caught myself being like, that's so interesting. I don't even know what I want to ask about it, but it really just caught me off guard in a way that made me super uncomfortable. And even my reaction made me even more uncomfortable with the fact that I was uncomfortable about it. But I feel like this is not an uncommon thing that is starting to happen in the workplace. And so I'm curious if you have any tips or tricks or thoughts about how we can kind of just be more aware and what we can do when we find ourselves in situations where we might be feeling a little bit of discomfort or awkwardness or unsureness because of the way that someone is presenting.
Yeah. Well, the first step is exactly what you said, is to catch yourself, right? And notice that discomfort is something that happens inside us, right? Discomfort is a feeling and it happens inside us. It's not like magically created by someone else. And then I think often the discomfort is with not knowing. And so I think it's really useful to ask ourselves, why do I need to know? What would I do with that information? Sometimes we do need to know something. If I am about to introduce somebody to someone else, and I don't know what pronouns that person wants to use, then I might need to know. And I can ask and say why I'm asking. Like, I'm about to introduce you to someone. I want to refer to you in a way that feels most respectful and accurate to you. What pronouns do you want me to use? Like he or she or they or something else. Other times it turns out the answer is, I want to know because I'm curious, but I'm not actually going to say or do anything different depending on the answer to why the person's wearing heels, for example. So if that's the case, then I'd say in most workplaces, if it's just for curiosity, just let go. You don't need to know then. If you're close, if you're like close colleagues, you know each other, then you might want to ask. And in that case, the reason for asking is because I want to know if there's anything you need me to know about that. A training participant asked me a few weeks ago, basically that somebody they work with who is a woman who may be presented more masculine than average started going by a different name, started going by a nickname, and they weren't sure if that was about gender for that person or not. And that you kind of do need to know because it might have to do with how you refer to them, what pronoun to use or something like that. So the person said, hey, I see that you're using a new name. I'm going to try really hard to remember. Thanks for letting us know. By the way, are you also using a new pronoun? And the person said, no, thanks for asking. And that's all that you need to know, right? That's the question is there something that I need to know in order to work effectively with this person or in order to talk about them or with them in a respectful way?
It is so practical, right? It's not about me knowing to satisfy some curiosity or even just get better understanding. Really, it's just about like me being able to be a better colleague in our workplace together. And I'm so glad you brought up pronouns because that's exactly where I wanted to go next, which we're now shifting from gender expression to gender identity, correct?
Sort of, because many of us don't remember fifth grade grammar class, right? Pronouns are words that we use in place of nouns to make sentences less repetitive. And they include words like I, you, we, she, he, they. All of those are pronouns. With regard to trans inclusion, we're usually talking about the third person pronouns, he, she, they, and so on, because in English, they're gendered. And being called a pronoun that doesn't align with your gender identity can feel very disconcerting. It can make someone feel unseen. And in some cases, if I've already told you what pronouns I want to be called and then you use the wrong one anyway, one way I think of that is that's a boundary violation, right? If I've said, this is how I feel okay being treated and you can't do that, then it's not just that I don't trust you to understand my gender. I don't trust you to respect my boundaries in general. It's not exactly the same as gender identity, though. And the reason is that in English, non-binary gender pronouns or gender pronouns that are not specifically masculine or feminine are very new, and what they mean is kind of in flux. It's always been true that people in English used singular they to refer to somebody whose gender they don't know, to a hypothetical person, right? That's not new at all. It is actually older than modern English. It's in the Canterbury Tales. It's like totally baked in to the language. But it is relatively new to be using it specifically to refer to someone who's asked to be called that because he or she don't feel right to them. And its meaning is constantly evolving. For some people, using singular they really feels neutral. For some people, it doesn't feel neutral, but feels more specifically non-binary or even specifically queer. And some people who are non-binary, meaning they don't identify simply as a man or simply as a woman, but something else. Non-binary is very broad in that sense, right? Basically anything else besides just man or just woman. People who are non-binary can still choose to use he or she pronouns because it affirms some piece of their identity or some piece of how they live their gender in the world. People who are not non-binary can sometimes choose to use they just as a way of de-emphasizing their gender, but not because they don't identify as a man or a woman. When we're asking someone's pronoun, one of the reasons that's uncomfortable for some people is it feels like a personal question. Like how I must be so nosy to say, do you use he or she, right? It's not actually such a personal question. It's not the same as asking, are you a man or a woman, or what kind of man or woman, or what kind of non-binary, or any of that. It's just simply asking, how should I refer to you in this context? I say context because it might be, if I'm in a relatively safe and affirming workplace, I might say, yeah, call me they, them. That's a great way to refer to me here. I might also say, please don't do that in front of the my boss's boss who doesn't usually work in this office, and I don't need that person knowing that about me, right? Or I might say, don't use that if you run into me on the street and I'm with my grandma. Like, people make different choices about pronouns that are usually related to their gender identity, but it's not exactly the same.
Yeah, I appreciate the nuance and also the context you're asking for, right? That you're saying, like, this is how I want to be referred to in this space and how important the workspace in particular is and how it's different from other, maybe more personal or different spaces. You mentioned that you can ask someone that it's like not a personal boundary violation to say, how would you like me to refer to you? Is that something that we should be doing with our team? Should we just be like having a conversation with every single person? Should we make it a team effort, or should we all be putting our pronouns on our Zoom handles? Like, what is the way to both be respectful but also like not make it a thing that it doesn't need to be a thing?
It won't look exactly the same in all contexts. Like the people, the culture of the place, all of those do matter. I think it would be a really good thing for all workplaces to have a way for people to communicate what name and pronoun they want to be called before their first day at work. And that could be part of onboarding. And that does not necessarily mean like doing a go round in front of everybody, but having a way for people to communicate that so that we're not guessing, so that we have that information. It is often appropriate to have pronouns in email signatures or Zoom names, or to just share it in a round of introductions with a new group. But those have to be optional. And the reason it has to be optional is that for non-binary people and some trans people, sharing our pronouns can immediately out us to everyone in the room. And that might not be the first thing we need everyone to know about us, right? I'll also say with Zoom name tags, it's helpful because it's right in front of you and you get reminded all the time, right? With email signatures, I don't think someone I've emailed with is going to memorize that and still know it by the time we meet, right? So the real purpose in an email signature is not so much to tell them what my pronoun is as to signal that I'm a safe person about that issue. And so if that's the purpose, what I do with my email signature is I don't have pronouns in it, but I have a statement that says, I care about how you want to be treated. Feel free to tell me your pronouns, your access needs, and anything else that you want me to know, which is signaling the same thing, but without necessarily centering my gender. Because I don't only work on trans issues, and sometimes I don't want my gender to be the center of the conversation, which it would be if I put my pronouns in my email signature.
Let's talk about what happens when, and you mentioned this before, that like, someone tells us, please refer to me as he, they, and we make a mistake. I have been there. I think everyone in the world has been there at some point or the other. What do we do in those moments to be respectful, but also to get to their side and get better at it?
Yeah. So two things. First, as you mentioned, the example of when someone uses he, they. So when someone uses two different pronouns like that, he/they or she/they, usually what that means is either is okay. And it would be great to hear both on a regular basis, but you don't have to put both in every single sentence. And people often get confused about that. So I just wanted to clarify that. And then when you make an error, the thing to do is acknowledge it. If the person is present, they definitely noticed. Don't just keep going as if it didn't happen. Apologize, and then move on and have the communication you're trying to have. Sometimes people make a mistake of over-apologizing, which kind of puts a burden on the person who's already just been misgendered to like take care of the other person's feelings, right? An apology that's like, I'm sorry, I should have said, and then go on to say the thing you were just saying, but with the right pronoun and continue the conversation, that's great. An apology that's not so great is like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I can't believe I did that. I really am trying. I'm not transphobic. I actually know a lot of trans people. Like, enough, right? That's a great conversation to have later with another ally who can help you get past it and maybe practice using the right pronoun and so on. Not a useful conversation to have in the moment when you've just messed up.
Okay, first off, thank you for explaining the he, they. And I only even realized that I said that was because it was one of my questions I wanted to make sure I asked you about was like, what is up with this both approach? Because I never really understood it. So thank you for explaining that. And also, such a great thing just in general, when we make a mistake, like we don't need to be overly apologetic. We just acknowledge we made a mistake and we correct it and we move on. One of the things one of the tactics that you talk about in the book is how to practice more using pronouns and kind of switching in your brain from what you think you should use to what you've been asked to use. And I say think meaning because we make so many assumptions about people, right? So can you share some of those tips and strategies to help our brain kind of just get more practice and more muscle memory around using pronouns in different ways than we might have traditionally used them?
I think part of it is practicing thinking in different ways. And this is not always the reason, but often the reason it's hard to get a particular person's pronouns right is because we're not thinking of them right. We're not thinking of them as the gender they say they are. And so getting at like what is the assumption that's getting in my way of thinking of this person in the way they've described themselves? And there's all kinds of activities in the book about that, about questions to ask ourselves to figure out what exactly is in my way in this case, right? But then even sometimes that's not what it's about. Sometimes it's just about habit. And in that case, I think one way is to practice using the pronoun maybe more than you need to when you're talking about that person anyway. I do talk to my cats, right? But I don't usually tell them all about my day. But I could, if I needed to practice, decide to tell my cat all about my day with my new colleague whose pronoun I'm practicing and use the correct pronoun during that conversation, right? In particular, to develop some sort of fluidity with being able to change pronouns when somebody's pronoun changes once you've already gotten to know them. I think renaming pets or repronouncing pets is a great way to do that. You know, my dog knows her name, but she doesn't know that she uses she. She's just not that good at English. She will not care if I start calling her he or they or both for a week until I get used to it and then switch back and start developing the facility to attach different pronouns to the same person so that I can respect them on their journey as their journey continues moving.
I want to ask another question about pronouns around alternatives to he, she, and they, which I have not yet come across in the real world, but I have seen in writing and had conversations with folks about, is this something that you've heard? Can you talk a little bit about some of these alternatives and if we should be thinking about or aware of them or kind of what we should do with it, or just know that it might happen? And I don't know. I don't even know what the question is here.
Yeah. So before they started to be used specifically for non-binary people, people were working on coming up with other pronouns, and they're often called neo-pronouns because they're newly invented. I think the most common set is these, yours, and there are quite a few other sets in circulation as well. I've heard some linguists speculate that it's actually a lot harder to incorporate a wholly new pronoun into a language than it is to start using they in a broader way. I sometimes hear people say, like, out of frustration with all the new words to learn, like, they is so confusing because it's both singular and plural. Couldn't you have come up with a singular one? And I find that hilarious because we did come up with some singular ones and people absolutely refuse to use them for the most part. And singular they has been picked up much more broadly and more rapidly than those ever were. There are other ones still in use. And I think when somebody uses that pronoun, it is really helpful to practice it, journal by using that pronoun, or talk to your pets using that pronoun, talk to yourself using that pronoun, right? Practice it so that you can use it. It's tremendously helpful in showing somebody that you care about what makes them feel okay and comfortable in an interaction. And in the meanwhile, it's also okay to avoid using pronouns until you're ready to get it right. And that's also great for if you don't know someone's pronoun but have to say something about them. Many people use they as a default until they know, or just avoid using pronouns until you know. And if you're using they as a default, that's great, but that should be for everybody then, not just for people who you think look trans. Because we notice that, and it's actually brand new since singular they has become so popular that now trans people, like when I'm out in the world, mostly people guess he, and that's one right answer, and that's good enough for me. But recently, as soon as people know I'm trans, they start using they without asking because that's their default for trans people, not for everybody, right? That's not respectful. If you're using they as a default until you know, then you have to understand that you don't know for anybody unless they've actually told you.
Can you just share the quick anecdote about the history of the word you? Because I feel like this question around they and they for singular and like grammatical correctness has definitely come up in many conversations I have been in. So when I read in the book about the term you and its shift, I was like, now at least I have something I can point to around our kind of grammatical history as an English-speaking language.
Yeah, this is a great one for grammar nerds or people who just really want to know why. There's a little jingle about it to help us remember that goes, roses are red, violets are blue, singular they is older than singular you. Historically, you was only plural, and the singular is thee, thou, thine, and so on. You was used as plural and also formal. So it was in a similar way to many Romance languages where the plural is also the singular formal. So it was used for royalty, like we still say the royal we, right? It was also the royal you. And as socioeconomic dynamics started to shift and the role of royalty and nobility started to shift, it just got gradually broader and broader. So it was royalty, and then it was nobility, and then it was kind of anyone of higher rank than yourself. You would say you rather than thee. And so eventually thee diminished to where it was basically only used in either very intimate circumstances or in prayer, because that's intimate language. I don't think that these are exactly parallel, but there is precedent for language, even pronouns shifting because of shifting understandings of social categories kinds of people, social roles, and power relationships, right? And that is happening with singular they also, that it's being used in different ways because of shifting understandings of gender.
Oh my gosh, we have to wrap up, but I'm finding this just so helpful. And the context, but also the practical approaches for like how we can be in relationship with people in a way that feels authentically good to them and hopefully for us too. So Davey, tell us, where can we keep up with you, keep up with your work, learn more about what you're doing, and get a copy of your book?
The website to keep up with me and my work is thinkagaintraining.com. And you can also find us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram by that same name, Think Again Training. The book is available at bookshop.org and also, Amazon and any other place that you buy books, but bookshop.org is the easiest and most direct way. I wrote that book in 2017, and since then, how people prefer to learn has shifted. So I've also just recently created a self-paced training that covers a lot of the same content as the book, but updated, and you get to do it rather than just read it. That includes videos, text, activities, discussion boards, and everything. So that also you can find at thinkagaintraining.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for joining me today. Such a wonderful conversation.
Thank you. It's been great to talk with you.